Well, good evening, everyone. Today what we are going to be discussing are the techniques of Rubens, Rembrandt, and Van Dyck. I do feel obligated to put Van Dyck up here. I have to admit I'm using a lot of his unfinished works to demonstrate a process, but I have to say I'm not really going to be talking about him very much in terms of his biography, but I do want to give him credit because he did leave us some really good information in those unfinished pieces. And just overall methods of the 17th century oil painting. And so here are the two kind of titans that we are kind of talking about here. So Rubens and Rembrandt. And Rembrandt, early Rembrandt especially, kind of really idolizes Rubens. There's kind of this, like, I guess, Rembrandtian myth, or kind of that he's easy to believe idea that he's trying to copy him and try to be the version of him, the Protestant version of him. But it's more like he's kind of just weighing himself up, because at this time Rubens is the most famous painter in Europe practically. And so he's dressing himself in the same clothing, in a similar position. Rembrandt even buys his house from the same realtor as Rubens, so he really goes out of his way to make some strides there. But we did touch on Rubens earlier in our lecture on Caravaggio. So Rubens does go to Italy to study, and he does do a copy of Caravaggio's The Deposition. And so he's exposed to Caravaggio. He actually, at the time, Caravaggio's painting of The Death of the Virgin was rejected by the convent it was commissioned for, because they found it too vulgar. And Rubens actually pleaded with his employer at the time to buy it. I don't think that actually went through, but he was really adamant that you must have this piece. Now, in the last lecture, I didn't make a quick mention of it, but I didn't really demonstrate it. So you can see that he's made some changes about the composition. So the woman's arms on the left-hand side are taken down. She's more the woman. She's basically erased that figure, and there are two additional figures in the back. So this is kind of a ensemble cast. That's a Titian painting. Those two people are actually from this other deposition, the Deposition by Titian. If you look at the two figures on the very far left, it's a mirror image reverse. And so he's studying the great masters, and he's taking a Titian, who is an earlier master, and Caravaggio, a more modern master, and kind of, I guess, equating them on the same level. So for a more direct comparison, these are the two figures in the back.
What is the time frame? What are the years we're talking about?
Between so with Titian versus Rubens.
Rubens, yeah.
I'm not sure exactly I can refer to my notes.
Or just when Rubens was.
So when Rubens was working, so Rubens is born in 1577. So he's working kind of in the early to mid kind of 1600s generally. Okay, so Rubens is married to Isabella, and actually is married for a very long time. And eventually, she actually is a model for a lot of Rubens' work in the early years. So this really lovely, and she kind of is really amused that she kind of like how directors use the same actors. She kind of just takes on different costumes, and she fulfills the needs. She's a saint in some. She's sometimes just a stage left woman or stage right woman, but she does pop up quite a bit throughout Rubens' art. Unfortunately, in Antwerp, the plague does break out, and Rubens kind of gets everybody together and moves out to avoid it. They do come back to Antwerp after everything has, the wave had quieted down. Unfortunately, though, Isabella does contract it and does eventually die of the plague, though. So this is some of Rubens' work here, and you can kind of see already why he is so lauded. I mean, so first of all, I have to say, even by today's standards, those lines are pretty amazing, especially this one that is on the very far right-hand side that's totally foreshortened. So that's a little tour de force here, and we talked again about that in Caravaggio as well, with those figures where, especially in the Supper at Emmaus, with the arms that are directly foreshortened towards you, it's a demonstration of skill that without breaking a line, he can kind of take you from the foreground to the background. And so he's kind of, in the far corner, it kind of nails us and leads us back to St. Stephen, I believe, and the lines that are that he's hanging out with here. So, and you can see that unlike Caravaggio, though, there is a kind of a return to this kind of Greek or Roman kind of canonical filter. So there's a naturalism, and he is using Caravaggio's use of natural light, especially if you look at the figure on the very far right, which also might be based on the Belvedere torso. If you look at that, that has a very similar actually gesture and posture. So you see that often in a lot of classical painting. You'll see references to other classical masterpieces. When you studied, you were called a journeyman because the idea was you would travel, and on your travels you would be doing sketches and drawing sketches, paintings that you would use as resources and models for works that you would bring back to your studio. And so it would be common for him to use, which we know he did do, a drawing of the Belvedere torso, to then use that as a reference for a model like this. So you can see he's using the highly darkened shadows against a high relief of light, that sculptural light effect. But when you start looking at the way that the figures are somewhat mannerized, and somewhat of like an elevated human, and as well as on the left-hand side, there is a certain level of perspective being convincing, but it does somewhat feel like a backdrop. There's a certain kind of like, there's a certain, I don't want to say obvious fictional element, but I don't kind of quite believe it as densely as I do a Caravaggio, where I believe that that is a densely realistic space.
What does he have as his arm? What was he swinging to?
Oh, it's a baby. Yeah. It's a baby. I believe. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I know. I really should have like vetted this image a little bit better. I know. I know. Everyone's like, "Wow, you've really exposed your true colors today." So this is the Slaughter of the Innocents, which is yeah. And so there's a lot. Wow. Okay. There are a lot of dead children on the floor here. So yeah. Yeah. So there we go. All right. So okay. So from that, we'll go to this. And this I've actually seen in person. It's at the National Gallery in London, and it's an enormous piece. And I mean, from the crimson of the red of the dress and the gold of the fabric, it really is just, it like glows off the canvas. The flesh of the man on that arm, this kind of hulk that he's given us, like it's really incredible in person. There are these kind of like, as skin has, these translucent blues, like blue veins and crewels that unfortunately you just have to be in front of it to really appreciate the true craftsmanship of it. But it is a beautiful piece. And one of the things about this that I especially love is it exposes the genius of Rubens as a composer, and he's very subtle about things. So if you look at so actually, first of all, before I forget, because I will, this does harken back to also, if you think to Caravaggio and the beheading of Holofernes, except in the case of murder, this is now lust, kind of another deadly sin. But if we look at, we have the old maid, young woman, sleeping Samson. So we have 1, 2, 3. And then if we zoom in and we look at the hands that are clipping, again, 1, 2, 3. And if you look at the actual hands, it seems like a very impractical way in which to cut a piece of hair. You're lifting one and then you're twirling it with the other. And then on the other side, you can see the woman's hand resting on the shoulder of Samson, who's taken a rest from having a good time that night. And so what Rubens is implying here is the complicated nature between the ability to love and hurt in relationships. And so with the simple gesture of this complicated intertwining of hands to clip Samson's hair and remove him of his powers, but yet there's a tender hand on the shoulder at the same time. So it's kind of an essay on the complicated relationship between those two extreme emotions in a relationship, essentially.
Would that be Delilah?
Yes, yes, yeah. There is also there is also an idea here that you see a lot in Dutch painting, especially because most of Dutch painting is kind of domestic scenes, kind of more. They're not so much history. Well, that's not true either. But in general, they're not as kind of theatrical as Italians, let's say, for example.
Then they have this disproportional.
Oh, well, right. So there are like so with Rubens. So that's one of the criticisms that Rubens has. So like Rubens is a very funny figure in art history because no one can deny his abilities or his credits and his contributions to art history, but a lot of people just don't like his taste or his handwriting, the way he handles contour. Um, like it's he's a really strange figure, and I kind of understand. There's a certain clumsiness in areas where it's kind of like, for example, the arm is and the back ratio, like there are some questionable things, but again it's this is poetry, not reality, and so this is kind of a hulk of a man. This is an above average human. Wait, was that it?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
so is that his wife as Delilah, or is that a different woman that used for his mom? Rubens. Oh, Rubens' wife. Is that Rubens'
Oh,
wife
yeah.
before the play?
Oh, yes. So that it is feasible because there is a certain similarity. There is also like so when we're looking at paintings of Isabella, um, actually, I think they went back a little bit further. There is a certain kind of similarity in terms of like the canonical presentation of the features. Um, this is also a time where artists of this era would have done what they would have called tronies, which are basically like if I had a model come over and I would paint them from different angles. So it's a economic way of hiring a model. I can just paint their head and then use that at my leisure to then fit into this painting I can take my time with, essentially. So it would be quite feasible that he would have done a number of these with his wife and then use them in any particular kind of order. So it is feasible. I would have to check the dates to see if there's any overlap, of course. But even then, he still could be using drawings, because as we'll see, there's actually a portrait of, well, we'll get to it. Um, but the other thing I wanted to mention about Dutch composition is this whole idea of a front and a back. So perspective, but in a domestic kind of domesticity interior scene. So there's a light in the front, in the foreground here, held by the old maid, and there's a light from the soldiers in the back as well. So again, this kind of duality, a light to illuminate, a light to harm. And so there's kind of this, but one is back, one is forward. And so it takes an otherwise dark corner of the canvas and makes it a momentary kind of explanation of perspective. And this does come up, and we'll see that in Rembrandt especially.
So this is also the shape of the
Yes, that is the proportions of the canvas. It's very squarish, actually. Yeah, so it isn't a true kind of like landscape. It is a little bit. It's not quite a rectangle. It's somewhere in between those two things. So what's interesting though about Rubens is like I remember reading somewhere, and I want to say it was Harold Speed, but I really could be wrong about that, so don't quote me. But I remember hearing somewhere some critic saying that in Rubens' universe, it takes all the energy in the world to wind a wristwatch, meaning that in every painting Rubens did, there's like little putti or cherubs coming down. Everyone's like twisted and winding. Everything is like basically over dramatic. And he even said words to the effect of, "I'm inclined to do large things and small peculiarities," or something to words of that effect. And here you can really see this. I wanted to put these side by side to kind of demonstrate the differences here, because that is actually Velasquez's strength. Velasquez does his best work when he is kind of like doing a solo, if you will. So these figures, Aesop and Menepes, these two philosophers, and these are two, Democritus. Am I saying that right? That is how you say that? Oh, okay. And I am forgetting the name of the other one at the moment. But in any case, you can kind of see that really Velasquez here kind of almost knows what he's doing, where when I'm looking at the two others, it's almost like there's a constrained energy is the best way I can kind of verbalize that. If you look at the man in the black robe, there's almost a zigzag in the composition. He's physically kind of barging out of the canvas. So this is really not Rubens' strength, is to be subtle and to be contained. But this is why Velasquez is kind of, you know, the portrait artist of the court, is because he does that so beautifully. He takes what this man on the left looks like a homeless beggar and elevates him to this ideal of a philosophical giant. So, and on that, and kind of on doing great things, Rubens is really known for his big works. He has he's just very large, I guess. He has a large personality. His vision is large. His execution is. He has an enormous workshop. So he has a workshop of students that help him execute. He's kind of like, well, a little like Amazon nowadays, where he actually, sort of, where he basically has, he's having a hard time fulfilling orders that are coming in so much. So he is using, basically, this is not really his invention. It's just, this is the established system where you would take those kind of, students would learn by working on elements within painting, and it was through that rather than through a formalized instruction like we have today. And so students would be helping with parts of this, and eventually it would be, it's more that when you get a Rubens, for example, it comes from his workshop, the master has approved it and it has left his workshop, more so than he has done every single part, because that would be like really disheartening. As a painter, that would be really disheartening. But it really is him at his best, and you can, and this painting of the Descent of the Cross is really influential for the other person that we're talking about, which is Rembrandt. This is what Rembrandt does, but how different. But you can really see, again, just like with the etching, the self-portrait, you can really see that he's kind of kind of calling on Rubens. When you look at the positioning of the figures, very similar. Except here, Rembrandt is kind of changing this to an interior, first of all, a night scene. This is kind of the night after the death, and it kind of heightens the emotional tension of it. It's almost like grave robbers in the night coming to take away a dead body, as opposed to this kind of more, again, almost Renaissancean kind of elevated version of that. Both beautiful for very different reasons. So, and then of course Rubens gets this enormous portrait, this enormous commission from Maria de' Medici. And the whole commission kind of involves 22 paintings that are 4 meters high, and they consist of paintings about herself, such as her riding through the countryside. So these are most of them. And so you can see the necessity to have a workshop. So you would, to fulfill these orders, if you want to call them that, would require a very large workshop. So he built a workshop and styled it after Italian architecture, of course, and had a cabinet of curiosities. So in the 19th century, you'll hear that term a lot, cabinet of curiosities. And it was a way that the kind of the wealthy would accumulate objects from around the world, and it was their way of kind of build an ability for someone who is of thought to contain the world in their studies. You have elements from around it, you kind of muse on them, think on them. And Rubens was so eclectic and had such rarities, including a full mummy from ancient Egypt, that it was a stopping point for like diplomats and aristocrats, and all, like that alone was. And it provided also an inconspicuous meeting place for politicians to meet, because it was very common for artists to kind of move around in different royal courts at the time.
How long did it take?
So this goes on for, if I want to say about 2 years, I think, 2 to 3 with the.
All that 2 years?
Okay. Here's another, just to kind of show you the scale.
Where is this? Yeah, where is it?
This is in the Louvre right now. So these were supposed to be, this is where my knowledge kind of trails off a little bit. From what I've read in adjacent to this project, Maria de' Medici was not liked very much, and eventually I think she's expelled, but I think, or banished rather. But you kind of understand why. I mean, all of these paintings are about her, and they were going to decorate her palace. So like it is a little kind of, a little narcissistic. But in a way, it does offer Rubens, like kind of a chance for Rubens to do what Rubens best, really kind of define kind of that, I mean, this is the reason there's that descriptor of a Rubenesque figure, where there's kind of a generous body type, although it was criticized as well. If you compare this to, this is where Rubens is kind of maybe pushing things a little bit, where if you think of your typical Renaissancean kind of woman, this does have much more of a naturalism to it comparatively. And so on those notes, he was kind of criticized here. But I do think that it is, I have to say, like, when you really think about it, it is odd a little bit. Like, so like you have like these kind of water equivalent of satyrs kind of coming up, sirens probably. And then you have the angel floating above. It just seems very I guess gaudy is the right word, but in the best sense. It's like it's like this is when it's done like at its most opulent. I mean, when I have, as a painter looking at all of this, the part that kind of like gives me the most anxiety is all that architecture, the corners, the perspective. Like I like get short of breath looking at that. The figures, you kind of it's going to be a battle until you get there, but
Does anyone know whose idea it was, each of those panels, the mythological or religious themes? Was it a collaboration between Rubens and Rembrandt?
So that I don't know. That actually would be a good question to kind of to know exactly how much of her input was factored in. They don't have a good relationship. He's actually, by the end of the project, he's actually out $60,000 by it because she just didn't pay. She just yeah. So it doesn't end well, but he does he's really the bigger person and kind of completes the project and everything. But it's yeah, I don't really know. That would be a good question because she was a very opinionated person. So, so at this time though, this region of Europe is divided between the Dutch Republic and the Spanish Netherlands or Belgium area. So this is divided. This is where religion and state are basically one, and it's at a time where Catholics and Protestants are kind of at daggers drawn, as it said. So the basically the southern is Spanish, therefore Catholic, and the north is Protestant, and that kind of factors out here. So Rubens being kind of more of being a Catholic, and Rembrandt, of course, coming from the north. And there's another painter that does comment on this. This is Vermeer's Allegory of Painting, and this is really one of those. So there's one of those times when you're looking at a painting and you just kind of get even nose to nose with it, and you're just like, I still don't believe a human hand made this, especially a human hand hundreds and hundreds of years ago with much far less technology. It's really an incredible, a miracle of oil painting. But the political tensions are kind of hinted at, or one of the ways you could read it is if you look at the context of it. So there is a map in the back that I just showed you, but just horizontally inclined. I know it might be a little difficult to make out. So, but if you rotate that horizontally, if we were to focus in a little bit more, oh, I should have done that before, but you can see that much more clearly. There's a crease in the center of the map, not too different from where the crease was I showed you, where the division of Catholics and Protestants were. And so it's a visual comment on that, but if we look at what's going on here, she is holding all the accoutrements or all of the regalia that the figure of history is usually associated with. And if we look at the painting of her, it's just the beginning. And so one way that the painting could be read is Vermeer is saying that it's a starting over from a previous kind of schism, and this is kind of a fresh start, a fresh history, a new beginning. And it's just, I mean, the map alone, let's go back to that. That map deserves, the map itself could rule a nation. It's just so, I mean, so even if the camera obscura, not to go on a tirade here about that whole camera obscura thing, but even if he did use the camera obscura, which I do have to say was never found in the inventory after his death, so just saying, but it would still, if that would be a readily available tool, why aren't there more Vermeers? So there was some, even if he had that tool of assistance, he could work it the best, and that alone deserves credit. And yeah, anyway, this painting is not, it's not that big. I mean, so Vermeers generally are not that big. The dimensions, yeah. And also, I mean, it's also a bold compositional choice for like a quarter of the canvas to be cut off and just go into dark. And basically the thing that's closest to me, I can't see. And again, this all has the peeling back the curtain, turning a new page. It's all about that kind of a symbol of rebirth. So right, so classical history. So again, this idea of a past and kind of present idea, and also it would be a common tool in the artist, as we're really familiar with. But Rubens does have a track record as a politician, and he does, as I was saying earlier about his cabinet of curiosities, he was able to kind of negotiate on behalf of the Spanish and with the Spanish and the French on on behalf of Isabella, not his wife, who became ruler of the nation because her husband had passed, and a peace treaty was ending between the North and the South. And it was not very suspicious, again, like I was saying earlier, for painters of court to travel seamlessly without too much problems from court to court, regardless of affiliation. So it provided an ideal path for somebody, given the given the proxy, to travel in that method. And he is made a gentleman of the house in 1627, which I'm assuming means he has special access to the court and to to Isabella, the ruler herself. But he does actually, as far as Rubens is concerned, he does eventually have he does retire from politics, and does retire from that part of his life, and dies of a gout attack in 16. But after his first wife Isabella passes away, he actually is that actually does really wreck him, and he buries himself in work, partially the diplomatic work, to kind of as a distraction, and he. Years later, he does marry again and has 5 children, and she's 16 and he's, I believe, in his 50s at this point. But this is, yeah, I know. But this was not that I'm saying that yay that, but it wasn't uncommon at that time period. But as usual, our interest as painters is to kind of view kind of art history through their technique, and so getting into Rubens' technique. So this quote here by Ernst Wertering, I hope I'm saying that right. That's how I've been saying it for years. And anyway, so basically the painting process of the Baroque era can be broken down into 3 major stages. Now, finding stages or trying to break a creative process down into kind of segments, kind of almost like a plot, is a little difficult, especially when you're talking about someone's entire work as a whole. So most of these are kind of generalities, not to mention a kind of a country or a movement as a whole. But as we'll see, like if we kind of understand these basic stages or the principles of these basic stages, you'll be able to kind of understand how these paintings were constructed. So this is an explanation of what dead color is. So dead color is a phrase that we use very often here at the school. So for those of you who are my painting students, that's something you'll be very familiar with. And it does pop up throughout art history, but it means different things. And as we're going to see in the process, it also means different things in 17th century Northern painting as well. So here, dead coloring is seen as a means of kind of correcting as you go, so almost a beginning of sorts. And the Van Mander is saying that you would use a brush really freely. You would kind of be more free-forming in your adjustments. You wouldn't have, like in the Italian method, a perfectly worked out map or drawing, transfer, and then begin. So there's a certain level of artistic chance being allowed to participate.
Gary?
Yes.
Was it tonal or color?
The dead coloring? We're going to get into that. That's where it gets complicated. So the first stage of that 3-stage process is the inventing stage. And as you might suspect, this is really the drawing stage of the 17th century process. So this is a lion attack painted by Rubens. And you can see it has some of the hallmark things that's not too unfamiliar from our previous lectures about Titian, especially with the Italian version being the pentimenti, this kind of dark brown kind of linear drawing with brush that is very watered down, but in this case it's usually oil. Sometimes egg and an oil emulsion as well. So when you take a stand oil or a linseed oil that's been heated, it thickens and becomes viscous. And almost like making a mayonnaise, you can actually take egg and slowly actually emulsify the two together and make a painter's mayonnaise, if you will. I know it sounds very strange, but it creates a liquidity, if that's even a word, to the oil paint that and also a bit of drying because you're adding egg. It expedites the drying quite a bit. And they found through the Rembrandt research project, which was this huge movement in the 90s, these air pockets, and the size of air pockets could tell them, oh, this has egg in it, that doesn't, because it's watery. And so that could tell them if evaporation was happening. So anyway, getting back to the inventing. So here, again, there's no cartoon. So again, unlike the Italian Renaissanceian style, there's not a it doesn't go through that kind of almost creative bureaucratic vetting process. It's kind of a little bit more direct. And he is going, however, in some ways I feel like this is a little bit more bold, like you're using line work with brush and going right to canvas. Like to me, that seems quite bold. And you can see here that there is some tonal adjustments or additions as well, heightened with white. So there is a little bit of that. And so inventing is primarily linear, but it does have a bit of form modeling as well, or it usually does, but not always. Sometimes you will just see contour line and the modeling comes later. But more often than not, it does have white modeling. But again, there's a range of execution. So again, another unfinished Rubens. You can see like on the child that's a little bit more modeled. You can see the shoulder line about to disappear kind of in the next layer. So everything is mapped out, but it's more line-based than shape-based in some respects. And so that's, again, line, we're still kind of coming out of this egg tempera idea where you are painting with lines hatching, and drawing and painting are very kind of closely linked. So that linear mindset is still really taking over. Or well, I should say, is prominent at this time. So the inventing stage, so not so much the clothing or not the garments here. I'm going to get to those in a minute. But if you look at the portraits, the cherub, that is all the inventing stage. So again, brown, so usually a transparent brown or an earth brown, or what was called palette gray. Painters of this time had a glass vase that actually we will see in Rembrandt's studio, with a complicated name that I can't remember, but it's a glass vase where painters would wash brushes in the oil. And over time, the sediment, which you all probably are familiar with if you're a painter, they would take that paint sediment and mix it with white and use that to create a value scale with, so nothing went to waste. You have to remember that you had to make your supplies every day, so you wanted to make sure nothing was scrapped. So they would use that kind of a palette neutral, if you will, to tone canvases, to do the underdrawing with. So when they do segments, like cross sections of these underdrawings, it's a really complex mixture of like earth reds, yellow ochres, and there wouldn't be any reason why someone would come up with a complex mixture just to do line work. So it seems feasible that it's that residue from brushwork or cleaning palette knives, things like that. So, and it also really is like drawing. You can see hatching here by Rubens. So he is really cross-hatching. And you can see that a lot actually in some of the more transparent layers, which of course you have to see it in person to see it best. But you can really still see some of these, which some of them are done in ink to also expedite drawing time, which is also a way you can seal charcoal drawings. After transferring in charcoal, you can kind of take ink over that to kind of, for a brushed effect. But it is really directive. So like, I mean, he's even kind of going in for hair loopies, like, these kind of very linear expressions of hair. And here at various stages of completion, you can see the two figures in the back are much more in the inventing stage, whereas the man on the right, he's a little bit more involved into the dead coloring / working up stage. And you can kind of see the signature of the paint. Really, the thicker it is, the further along it is, the more transparent, the earlier in the process that it is.
Was he using models for this?
Yeah, most likely was using models for references at least. In terms of faithfulness to models, that's a little hard to say. Rubens' figures are always a bit kind of more elevated, so I'm sure at times he's basing them off of reality, but he's more interested in painting the human figure kind of perfected, kind of like an elevated version, very much how like Michelangelo was trying to sculpt a perfect human in a way. So it's probably like a little bit yes and no, essentially. Yeah.
Would you say the idealism was the fashion of the time, or is that just his choice?
Well, so that's definitely the fashion. I mean, so this is where, like, I think Rome is really the hot spot. Like, artists travel there, with the exception of Rembrandt, and that's kind of one of the things that kind of he takes pride in. Um, and basically they import Italian taste to kind of the northern regions, and so people want to be artistically want to be more like the Italians. So that becomes Rembrandt's problem a little bit later when the generation after him takes over and they're inheriting trust funds and they want to be more like the Italians and opulent and kind of importing foreign tastes, and that really just disagrees with Rembrandt, the kind of the independent kind of patriot. Um, well, I don't know if he was a patriot, but still. Um, but yeah. So does that answer your
Yeah,
question?
yeah.
Oh, okay. So anyway, so this is Van Dyck. So finally, Van Dyck kind of enters the scene here. This is actually in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and I've seen this many times. And it's actually so this is a Trony. So this was a young. You can see he has a black cloth and a white cloth. So the white helps to show that how this fair skin is not white. It's to help colorize the fair skin. The black is to help to make it neutral so that he can kind of more easily kind of like cut and paste into another painting. But when you're using the inventing, the idea is that hopefully you're still working right from the start. Like David Lafell, I don't know if any of you are familiar with David Lafell. He has this saying where it's like you start the finish and then you finish the start. So basically you start off with the finish in mind. And that was very much, the idea at this time. So the hair that we're looking at here is completely transparent. You can see right through it. That's the inventing stage where he's using just one shade of brown in varying transitions. It's a little hard to see in this, but if you look at it online, you're going to see lines and letters. This is actually a grocery list that Van Dyck repurposed into a panel to paint on. And in the Met, they actually have translated it, and you can actually read the list. And it's like so many eggs, 2 flagons of wine, and all this sort of stuff. So you can see how it was a craft, and so there was a certain like, I'm just going to make this work, lack of preciousness, and a little bit less concerned for is this going to survive for 800 years. But it is, but it does go to show you that all of that hair is day one, session one. That is not reworked in later stages.
So are Van Dyck's underpaintings brown? Or are they?
Both. They're both brown and they're black and white at times. They kind of fluctuate. I always like it when Van Dyck gives himself permission to kind of let loose a little bit, because he's one of the few painters. So the typical kind of motif of the arc of a painter's life is they start out very polished, tight, academic, and like they're trying to impress with their skill sets, and then they get more painterly as they age. They just kind of see what's important, and they kind of become more reductive. He is a little bit in the opposite. His early work, especially this fantastic like portrait of a head that's very famous, is like super loose and brushy, and he tightens, especially as he moves to England. He tightens up incredibly. I mean, it's beautiful, but he's one of the few artists that goes opposite the normal arc. But I love that contrast, like this kind of really loopy kind of line work for the white here. So getting into dead coloring here.
Do you know where the term dead coloring comes from?
So there's a couple different interpretations of that, and that's kind of partially defines kind of the like how it's used. So dead color sometimes is, well, actually, so here it says because it fills in an area of the outline with only one color. So it's kind of this idea that it is just one color. You're not really showing modulations. So if you think back to that kind of that inventing stage where it's just white and brown, one application of dead coloring in the 17th century is to put a flat color over that. So it's almost like you're doing a grisaille underpainting, and then you're putting a thin layer of color over that. But it would be singular, so it wouldn't be like you would be like all the drapery is red. You wouldn't be putting like different shades of it. So very simple.
So, but the term dead is.
Just because it's like not, I guess, not moving at all. It's just like a flat singular piece. The other interpretation, inactive color, exactly. But the other interpretation is that a grisaille, dead coloring, being that color being dead, it's removed from the setting, and so it's a dead coloring. It's just a grisaille. So here's where it kind of does get a little complicated, because there is this two kind of staged or 3-stage definition where it's lightly color applied over the inventing, that was heightened with white. So brown and white underpainting, a thin layer over top. So that's one application. A second application is a full-blown monochromatic underpainting, where it's not as linear, it's more, you have more values, it's more sculptural, and we'll see an example of that in a minute. And then lightly applied color with white paint in the lightest areas. So basically, if you imagine that first explanation where there's a thin layer painted over the inventing, some artists will then paint white into that layer, reaffirming the highlights and to kind of build form to build their paint layer because the light is transparent. So that, all that is to say, you can see there's a range of execution, all of which falls under this generalized term of dead coloring. But one interpretation of that is to be doing, so that again, this linear washy state. So this is a Rembrandt, and you can see here that basically forehead yellow, cheek area red, and he's coming back with a little bit of white to reinforce where the lightest lights are, to say this is where the light facing plane is. This is again a preparatory, this is unfinished, this is not, he didn't intend for people to look at this. This is a preparatory stage, but you can see this is a carpeting. He is going to build on this, and so you can see that also the brown kind of showing through this layer as well. So very simple, with a little bit of working to elaborate, but very simple. And so over here we can see the inventing on the left leg over here, and we with that brown line on the edge. And again, an example of dead coloring. There's the brown shadow, and on top of it there is this peach color with a little bit of white worked into the foot and a little bit of white worked into the thigh. So it's basically a washy grisaille to start off with, a semi-transparent layer of limited color to describe the modeling, and you are then building from there on out, essentially.
Is that a Rubens?
Yes, this is Rubens. Can't you tell? It's so hulky. So, but there is another interpretation of dead coloring, which is a fully modeled underpainting and a full grisaille. So this is where it kind of gets into semantics, because can I call that the inventing stage? Yes. So this is where, again, it gets a little murky, but we try to apply those kind of general terminologies. So these are by Van Dyck, and these are actually not meant as paintings. These are done as examples for engravers to carve. So these are actually models for someone else, which is why they're in black and white, because an engraver doesn't need color. But what's great about them is that we can see his technique removed with the complexity of color removed. And you can really see how far an underpainting can be taken, to a point where basically you're then glazing over top and doing really minimal work into it. So like Caravaggio, you can see around the bag of the eye that Van Dyck is actually using the tone of the canvas as part of his halftone. So he is not feeling obligated to get rid of it. If it works, he keeps it. He's also using so lead white is transparent, for those of you who aren't familiar. So it has like a veil-y quality, lacy quality to it. And you can see here the cheek is really built up. There is a mound of white on that highlight. And as soon as that happens, right after that, you can see this kind of blue-gray take effect. And that's the white thinned out, kind of pulled over this dark ground. So artists of this time are starting, this is kind of the dawn of this play of the sculptural elements of paint. And so by lead white also does behave, here's a fun word, thixotropically, where when you push it around, it behaves like a liquid, and when you don't, it behaves like a solid. That's how I describe my body type. So one of the other things about this that you can see are, and it's a little hard to see here, but he is taking pure vermilion, unadulterated pure vermilion, and painting in the lip, and he is painting in the underside of the nose. What artists of this time will do, sometimes you'll see these deep reds and kind of question how that happens. Sometimes it is a red lake, but here the flat vermilion is placed, and then like a thin burnt umber is kind of rolled over that, and that looks really deep red and more of like an earthy crimson in a way. So by starting off that intensely, it's dark, it does the job, and it kind of it's a little bit of optical blending. We call in the biz. Yeah.
So he was just putting straight vermilion on.
Yeah.
Was he waiting for that to dry?
Yes, absolutely. So there's definitely this is definitely a layered approach. And in fact, dead coloring was often something where you would actually bring a painting to and stop. So you would actually bring a painting up to this kind of monochromatic rendering to give clients an idea. And then on request, you would then like take it off the wall and then finish it, so that way you could develop a lot of different templates, if you will. And then on request, it's a more efficient way of working because all you're doing is working with value and that. So and here's an unfinished Rembrandt where you can see very much that. In fact, Rembrandt's teacher, Pieter Lastman, actually, I think when he died, in his inventory there were like 10 dead color paintings. So paintings that looked like this, which are an earth, umber, and ochre ground, sometimes a yellowish ground that Rembrandt used, with this transparent brown drawing. Again, you can see a linear emphasis though. And when you look at the lines, again, it's a little clumsy because again, it's direct to canvas. He also knows that the layers coming can help shape things and he can make it work. There is a little bit of treatment in the background, so it does look like he started to work this up. The sky in the back is filled, and the sky above is also filled with at least one layer of color. And so that also is evidence of the work ethic of this time period, where you would work distance from back to front. So sky, landscape furthest away, and then like layers, you just work closer and closer to provide for natural overlaps. But you can see the full effect here, and it really is kind of a very economic way of painting, where you have a series of these skeletons, and and a client can say, "Oh, I like this one," and you can just finish up on request.
Are there pencil drawings, presumably to develop the ability to be able to just paint without, just
well,
drawing?
So in some instances, so this is again where it's kind of a mixed bag. With Rembrandt, like it's kind of like early on maybe a bit, but he's not really he's kind of known for breaking that kind of normative. Rubens would probably actually have had, especially for some of the larger pieces, would have probably had some kind of construct or some kind of like preparatory drawings, and again would probably do this idea of having models brought in, possibly having drawings, and then the drawings are the models for the students, make that their kind of a thing. But I think that they were seen, they're not seen with a lot of preciousness. They're a means to an end. Like it's like they would just be like tossed out normally once done.
I don't know if you covered this and I wasn't listening.
Maybe I didn't.
When Rubens, so Rubens, you were saying, is kind of direct to canvas, right?
Usually, yeah.
So when did he train that way, or did he train was that the question you had? So like, did he train with pencil and then he just got so confident with it, he was doing his own work?
I think there is a little bit of that. I think that even before him, like Titian was already kind of pushing boundaries by being free-forming, not following the, being a good student, if you will, by doing the cartoon, and he was making changes on the fly, and that was kind of not usual for that time. So he wouldn't be the first to do that. I think it's kind of something that he inherited. I think as, painting advances, I think that he probably would have started out more conservative in his approach and just with comfort kind of loosened up, and then realized, oh, I could just go right to canvas. I don't need this this step anymore. But this is another Van Dyck, and again, this kind of goes to show you the power of value. Even that's a beautiful painting, even without any color at all. But again, it goes to show you the level in which the dead coloring could be taken to then apply, but still using the canvas. So if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see that the tone of the canvas, the imprimatura, or the inventing, he is keeping. Always this idea of what can I finish early? So just like with the Van Dyck and the woman's hair, the rock in this instance.
So was he also trying to be disproportional in that? Because the head seems to be smaller than
The hand and the shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
Is it just me?
No, I think
Really trying to do what Rubens was doing?
I think he was trying to be good, but we all have days.
We all have
Yeah. So but I do think I do think that he was akin to, so he was very much obsessed with Titian and Tintoretto, I believe. So he would have been very much a follower of that kind of philosophy of kind of like beauty and art being almost synonymous, and that whole elevated idea.
So a fully rendered Versailles like that, is it if you're doing a fully rendered grisaille and you're just glazing over it, is it a rather thin painting then?
Well, so that's where again it comes back to if you're using lead. If you're using lead, you're drawing so quickly, you almost don't have to worry about that whole kind of question in some ways. Um, but it's generally there. I would say traditionally there would not be a relief to it, but but with lead white you do have to pile it on for it to actually get lighter. So there would be some, but it wouldn't be like intent. Like I'm going out of my way to create the texture. That's just an essential to create the light effect, and I think that's kind of what's lost about impastoing today is that it had a technical purpose. It wasn't like I'm gonna make it thick here. Just gonna like kind of slap it.
Sure.
So now you can actually see the underpainting even in advanced years. Here is Rembrandt towards the end of his life, and he's using the underpainting as transitions, and he's using them strategically in very specific areas. He's using them in transitions of darker halftones, and he's using them where there are cooler areas. So if you do a black and white or a brown and white underpainting where it's very gray, and then you put thin color on top of it, it goes cool, almost looks like blue in some instances. So instead of actually mixing a blue, he's using the power of opacity and transparency to make that look like the bluey veins of the inner kind of bag of the eye, the side of the nose there. So they're really constructing paintings at this time. They're really thinking about how can I harness layers in order to achieve a maximum effect, as opposed to like nailing it all in one go. So using, even in his advanced years, he's still not abandoned this kind of almost entry-level application of using underpainting as the something to use in the final product there. So the working up phase is a bit more, all these stages are a little complicated to kind of like crystallize. Working up is a little bit harder because it's a work in progress. It's pretty self-explanatory, the working up. So here, so here we can actually see Van Dyck's inventing. We can see the curls of the hair, we can see the lines of the face, and the heightening of white. But it's kind of like a miracle of accident. So he's done his inventing with white, he's glazed it, and he's stopped for some reason. So what we're looking at is the freshly glazed inventing stage that he then, for whatever reason, had to stop. So it's a little hard to see in this, but when you look online, you'll be able to see, you can actually see the white coming through, and you can see that it's the start. So in working up, it would be, you would lay down a flat color, and they're not all the same colors. I believe it's like a yellower forehead, a pinker nose, a redder cheek. And you would then paint into that using white again to work up your forms, both physically, because again, lead is transparent. It would take painters sometimes layers, and that's where you would have to feel out. Sometimes it can take 1 or 2 layers, sometimes it's 5. But that complex layering of transparent lights and whites also creates cools and transitions that are really hard to accomplish when done just with direct painting only in one layer. But this is a really instructive piece because it really shows that in-between stage. It's always a little hard to kind of describe, or when you're doing it, you're asking, is this right kind of thing. So this is kind of in-between stages here.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When you're saying that they're glazing the color over that white inventing,
Yeah.
are they intentionally using transparent pigments to use, or are they just using the opaque pigments they have and just using them in a transparent?
They would be making them more. It wouldn't be exclusively transparent colors. So one thing about when you're researching classical methods, you really have to. Your modern mind really has to stop thinking. So I know that's. So shut that phone off. But like for example, I would have to make my paints almost every day. So I'm going to think of paint a little bit differently rather than if I'm just buying it from the store all the time. So what I'm going to be aware of, like a watercolorist, adding more water or less water to kind of make things kind of expand or change its properties. By making the oil paint, they would add more oil to make it watery. They would make it, or less. So they would calibrate their making of the paint that day to suit their needs. changing oils if necessary to change properties. So almost like an alchemist, the day would start by kind of by doing that. So yeah. So in this unfinished portrait study, this is also kind of an example of working up, where this is actually kind of the stage after the one we just saw. So this would be if Van Dyck kind of had more time. Now we're working into that, that beginning. So working into this beginning, it would not be just exclusively white. You would actually be working other pigments as well. So it's not like just white. There would be yellow, of course, vermilion, red ochre. So you would basically be painting a little bit more directly into this layer, with then a very long-haired soft brush to then kind of blend strokes out. So here you can see the inventing stage. We can see the line around the collar. We can see the beginnings here. And if you notice a planar interpretation of the collar on the left there, you see how the highlight is allocated to a specific place, and then there's designated grays on either side. So it's not just fiery hoops I make you jump through. There is a pedigree for it. I have a reasoning for it. But you can see these are flat tiles that in the layer next, he's going to build or work up to kind of develop. So you have to always be thinking a layer ahead and reacting to what the layer prior. What you can also see a little bit of here is not everything is completely blended. There is a certain kind of, you can see the strokes are still a little bit visible. There's obviously a high level of, that's very convincing. It's a beautiful study. But it isn't kind of quite as tight as we can see him do. So basically the way that the process started, it finished. So basically what they would do after this is that they would put another thin layer of color over this to finalize blending and actually get rid of the brush strokes. So in our terminology, it is a little bit like of what we would call a couch, except there are some areas or some paintings where it's just lead white, thinly applied, to kind of create a little subtle luminosity and to kind of get rid of brush strokes. So in some respects, it's almost a rinse and repeat process. You kind of then put a thin layer down or a dead color. You then start to work into that dead color and you repeat in order to kind of reach the appropriate working up level that you need per area. So, yeah.
Kind of unrelated, at the same time related question.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have a lot of variety in terms of like chromatic reds, so vermilion. Is it transparent or pink?
So I've used traditional, like the real vermilion. Yeah, yes, like the real actual mercury stuff. Yeah, it's I do have to say it's absolutely beautiful. Like I can totally, if I could buy it by the bucket, I would. It is a beautiful color. Working with it, and especially in its powder form, is toxic. But so it has, in my experience working with it, it has a very high tinting strength, very high. So it is, you really only need a little bit because its tinting strength is very high. So I found it to be more on the opaque end of the spectrum. There is also Chinese and French vermilion, and they are different in hue as well. I always get this backwards. I think French vermilion is cool and Chinese vermilion is warm, but I always get that backwards no matter how hard I try. But it's either yellowish or pinkish, and that's the discerning factor from where it's sourced from. So if Chinese is more orange, yeah, then French would be more blue. So it's kind of like almost pinky, but it is opaque. Yeah, it is opaque. Yes, that is the lead white. So this is actually kind of a little bit more of a graphic. This being an older gentleman, you can there's a little bit more visible paint strokes here. So this is beyond working up. This is also a layer of, this is working up essentially. So this is basically a layer that has been put over the inventing stage. He has then built up his forms with lighter values and thicker paint. You can even see hatch marks if you look closely. So if you look at the cheekbone here, you'll see actual striations you can find. Artists of this time were actually applying paint in a very hatchy manner. That's how they were trained to draw. You would draw with your stylus on metal point, and most drawings were rendered by hatching, not by smudging like we normally do. I mean, they did use that, but I mean, in studying, you would use metal point line work. So a lot of that is a carryover from that practice of putting things down in line. The other reason for that is you can also kind of weave things together. It's where you can actually kind of interlace strokes, and with a soft, long squirrel hair brush, you would kind of then like soften that, and it would just blend, 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 as long as your oils have the right properties as well. Also utilizing the tone of the canvas, so he's using that for the gray of the collar. So always thinking about like very opportunistic painting, very opportunistic. Oh, there. I'm like, if you can see it, and then I next slide is zoomed up. So you can see, and also, you know, in the 19th century, some paintings were called brush performances, and I always kind of like thinking of it that way because it is a demonstration or a performance of the brush. You're demonstrating almost calligraphically sometimes your skill with the brush, and you can see that they're thinking about, or Van Dyck is thinking about that here. The beard is he's allowing that bend in the wrist and kind of allowing himself coming down, and then the pressure sensitivity there. He's following the direction of the topography of the plane as he's hatching in these. So things that end up with a very spherical softening have a very structural beginning. So this is, again, a head study or two tronies of, so this would be a model that you could see him using this for an apostle or a historical figure of some kind. Now, this is kind of, again, where it's a little hard to say exactly what this is. This does seem to me like it is actually a layer of working up, because there are different hues in the skin. There is also a certain density to the paint that would indicate that this is not entry level or the first layer. So here, if you look at the beard and you look at the shadow, that is all the inventing stage. And again, you can see that if they use the brush correctly and they lift up, it creates the trail marks that kind of evoke a sense of hairiness with very little effort. The skin is that's where the building up has happened. And if you look at the neck, one of the ways you can tell that this is at least two layers of working up is that there are strokes on the neck that go in slightly different directions, which indicates that the layer prior would have to dry for that to happen. And so the chest here has had, I would say, at least two layers of kind of building up, or working up rather. I keep calling it building up. And this kind of gives a little bit of insight into the portraiture element of things, where you can see that even the wrinkles of the forehead are treated very graphically and linearly. He's really taking a round brush and kind of really kind of creating these linear dashes. The eyes kind of start out with this graphic kind of darkened circles and hard lines, starting from a very graphic beginning, really. But the forehead and everything else is modeled, but again, the cheeks are just red with a little bit of lightening. The yellow is forehead. The forehead is yellow with a little bit of lightening. And by doing that at the same time, you can see that he's able to lift off the paint on the forehead, creating a sense of a cast shadow, or an ombre from the cast shadow of the hair. And this is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art as well. And this kind of shows another trony, a much more finished trony though, which sounds like an Elizabethan insult. You're a trony or some kind. Don't be such a trony. But this really shows you the finishing level. So this is, and you can see that the word that comes to mind is a milkiness. There's a certain kind of satiny, kind of soft blended milkiness. And that's that final, so if you think about this layering process of a dead coloring or a flat layer of color, and you build that, the final layer kind of brings everything together, and it creates this really almost polished softness. The other thing that's helping him out a little bit is the fact that he's describing the hair so linearly. So my eye having that really graphic contrast, it then views the softnesses as softer, essentially. But still, that whole shadow is the inventing stage. You can see the line on the edge of the nose from the inventing stage. So really trying not to backtrack at all, which I think is also one of the reasons why you might see a little bit more mistakes, is where it's like, okay, well, we just got to keep moving, because there is a certain kind of craftsmanship production rate that was kind of more pressing at that time. And again, here, the bag of, so very much like Rembrandt, bag of the eye, transition of the shadow of the cheek, side of the nose, that's all that gray underpainting that he's allowing to come through to create a natural cool. It looks like it's very difficult to get blues on skin to work right and not look like a bruise or makeup or just something foreign. So starting out with it and letting it come through the layer is kind of a sneaky but yet really effective way of dealing with that problem. With the warms next to it, it kind of feels much cooler. The cheek in the foreground here does have a glaze of red over. You can really kind of see that if you're looking at it online. It's just a very warm, flat kind of red glow that's there. So there is definitely a final layer of glazing, which would have been done with a thickened kind of oil, like what we would call a stand oil of some, basically. It helps to suspend the paint particles a little bit better in that layer. So, and again, another version of working up. This is the torso of the legs. The pair of legs we saw earlier, this is who he is. So again, the inventing on the outside line, the building up as well. Okay. So now here's another example where you can really see the tone of the canvas, that yellowish tone, pretty much a fully finished face. And the linear hair. And what's amazing to me is that this hair is really kind of like almost drawing every strand, which is what I would really advocate not to do, but it's super effective. Again, this is kind of, it's not meant to be realism, it's meant to be based in our reality, but an elevated version of it. So the hair is kind of like thick gold, it's not really like, you know, thin human hair. Okay, so now getting into Rembrandt in contrast, with Rembrandt, studied in Leiden, and then studied with Pieter Lastman. This is actually at the MFA here. This is in Boston, and this is Rembrandt's teacher. I believe it's in the same room as some of his paintings as well. But this is the wedding night of Sarah and Tobias, and the story goes that Sarah had 7 prior husbands, and they were all killed by a demon on their wedding night. So the angel Raphael is like, hey, Tobias, this is what's up. And then he tells him that what you have to do to fix the problem is you have to burn the liver of a fish that you've caught. It will fumigate the demon out. And that's what's happening here. So you see Tobias lighting a fire, he's burning the fish liver, the devil or the demons are being smoked out, and you can see Raphael's kind of wrestling the demon away. Lastman, to be quite honest, is not a particularly great painter, but he does leave a lasting effect on Rembrandt. So if you take a moment to memorize the woman's position that you see in the bed here, and if you take a minute just to memorize her whole positioning, years later, Rembrandt kind of pays homage, where that is actually, again, a very similar pose, a very similar gesture, just a much more naturalistic take. So this is actually also at the MFA, and this is a very small painting that Rembrandt, it's a very tiny painting. And it's, yeah, tiny bit. Now, what's interesting about this painting is that painters of this time period sat as they painted. And that's evidenced by, if you look at the base of the easel, you'll see the feet wearing away the wood on either side. As they sit, they put their feet resting on. You'll see those little bevels there. So there has been essays on what this painting is all about, and the reason why is he's stepping back, and this idea, I think in Simon Schama's book, Rembrandt's Eyes, said that, you know, he's kind of guised in this kind of historical robe, and he's standing next to the tools of the trade. That's where you would grind your pigments, on that stone bowl. It's kind of this idea of the history and the modern and all this stuff. It's really hard to know. I think one really creative interpretation is also by Simon Schama, where if you remember back to a lecture prior, we talked about Apelles' line, the Greek painter who did an exercise of painting a perfect straight line. So he thinks of the edge of the canvas as Rembrandt's version of the Apelles' line, like him saying, this is the best, like this is me doing my best, kind of a type thing. I think it's a really creative way to interpret it, but no way of knowing that. But I think they're actually facing each other. But Rembrandt is known for his drama, his theater. So him and Jan Levens, a friend that they actually work together in the same studio, are visited by Constantine Huygens, who is a real bit like the biggest art critic of that time, and admires both of their work, although Jan Levens does paint his portrait, not Rembrandt. And he says that Rembrandt is superior in storytelling. Basically words to the effect of, Rembrandt's a much better storyteller, the greater pictorial effect. Levens is a better polisher, though, essentially. And you can see it here. I mean, this is the dramatic presentation, whereas earlier we were talking about Caravaggio using light as a sculptural sense, and you can see Rembrandt taking that idea and running with it, and also sculpting the dark, whereas Caravaggio would have a dark background, the emptiness of space or volume. Rembrandt is sculpting the darkness. So the darkness here is a medium, not just a contrast. And so anyway, I love this image of the. So this is Simon, I think, Christ being presented at the temple, and this figure where the head is just illuminated, and you get the fall of light. You see the penumbra of the cast shadow. Another demonstration of skill, showing a single object existing both in and out of shadow, with making it without breaking the line, so to speak. So this is his raising of Lazarus. Painted around the same time. And nope, that is not them. Where is Jan Levens here? Nope. Oh, that's right. Nope, I did want to talk about this first. So, yeah, I know, I'm skipping ahead in class. I forget that I changed the order at the last minute. So this is the raising of Lazarus around the same time. And this, again, is another painting that's done. It's really the closest thing he ever gets to a royal commission. Rembrandt is really wants to be like, make it big, make it famous, and he really is trying to live up to Rubens' fame level, or at least match it. He always wants to get a royal commission, never does. He wants to get a royal chain of being, which he would be awarded, never gets that. But this is the closest thing he gets to it, and he utilizes a compositional element of kind of camouflaging an emblem in the painting. And so in the back, so in this depiction of the resurrection, you can see the light mists and the rays of the light are actually creating the. Oh no, we saw this before with Bellini. And we saw that if you look at the rock formation behind and you actually kind of connect them, they subtly form the hand of God, that the saint is kind of standing in the palm of God. So he's seeing, well, maybe he's not seeing this from Bellini, but he's taking this kind of concept and he is making that known. This symbol of the P and the X is a Catholic symbol. It's taking the initials of Christ and overlapping them. So he's using that, and we see this again in years later. This is the symbol for reference if you're not unfamiliar. And we see this later with Rubens. Not Rubens, I'm sorry, Gainsborough, very different. So this is his daughters chasing the butterfly, and he's very cleverly arranged his daughters in the shape of a butterfly as a kind of a subtle underlining kind of means of that. This is, why is that still going? So anyway, so arranging his daughters in this. So this is a compositional device where you kind of are using the subject at hand as a mold in which to kind of design your composition around. But
something to think about for still life.
Something to think about for still life painters. Yeah, the trick is the magic trick works if I don't know how you did it. So the thing is to be sneaky about it. Like most of us don't see it right away until we actually kind of are shown that. I. So this is the raising of Lazarus again on the left, and this is his friend Jan Levens on the right, and they are working together, and you can see differences, but also similarities. Again, the Christ figure on the left. They shared models as well. Rembrandt's mother allegedly, we don't really sat for both of them. But you can see the difference here. So I kind of, when I look at these, you can see the figure of Lazarus is this corpse that's gradually coming to life. It's very kind of Halloween-like on the left in Rembrandt, and on the right, it's just these two hands that are shot immediately up, kind of out of stage. And I almost feel like Jan Levens is it reads like an opera. And see the two hands, almost like Frankenstein. Bottom left, yeah.
I'm looking at the white sheet or whatever that is.
Yes. So these are two hands that shoot straight up. But the death shroud, though, is really a beautiful, beautiful shape there, because it almost kind of, he does what Bernini is doing in his sculpture of Saint Teresa, where he's using the drapery as an expressive means, and this kind of the death shroud being lifted. He is being kind of reborn. But the Levens kind of reads like an opera to me. Like I'm almost watching this as an opera, and the Rembrandt looks like a movie to me. And I think that's a good way to describe that. I think Rembrandt, if he were alive today, would be a filmmaker. Special effects, all these. Are you kidding me? He would. I could totally see that happening. And that's really kind of differentiates them. Both great painters, though. Jan Levens really is wonderful. And to that point, look at that still life. Yeah. So Jan Levens, very skilled. I mean, I can't imagine painting next to this guy. You look over and you see that. I mean, I would be so depressed. So a fun fact, the left-hand side of the painting, this beautiful silver pitcher, the glass, the bread, that was added a year or so later on top of the painting. There's actually an unfinished book, so this painting was put aside for some time, and then he took it out and finished it sometime later. So the kind of the gem of the piece are late additions, really. But this really kind of just goes to show you a mastery of texture. I mean, the leather-bound book, the torn paper. So, for those of you who are thinking about tenebrism and you're on your tenebrism or just, you're thinking about that in general, aim high. So, yeah, aim high. And then another to me, a tour de force, he puts something enormously complicated, a globe, in the background, but does not make it come forward. I mean, that's somewhat hard to do.
But in this one,
Mm-hmm.
The three objects in the front
Mm-hmm.
are so small in relation to everything in the back. I mean, normally you might, maybe they're literally small,
Mm-hmm.
or is there something strange about the perspective
So,
of it?
well, that's also because they're late. They were added like years.
Right,
So they probably is like a.
compositionally.
Yeah, it's. I'm not exactly sure. I think the saucer kind of exists on both planes. It exists on this plane and the back plane. So it kind of justifies everything being there. Yes, those are all kind of, it's like books and piles of papers that are kind of pushed
Does it have a
together.
title?
It's really kind of something really just kind of generic, like Still Life with Books. Yeah. This is Jan Levens. Jan Levens.
How big is it?
The size of that, I'm not sure. I can see if I can find that for you, but I don't know off the top of my head. So I did mention this painting before, and again, if we think back to Rubens and Samson and Delilah, the two light sources. Although in Rembrandt it's very different. This is where Rembrandt really is a poet. The two light sources are not just for functional reasons. This is all about the act of thinking or introspection. So the single figure in the center represents the conscious mind. The window kind of represents our eyes, our ears, everything that is outside that is filtered inside. The spiral staircase is our thoughts kind of ascending into that kind of the subconscious going upward. But there's also that spiritual inner illumination that also kind of comes with that insight as well. So with just an individual and a room, Rembrandt is able to kind of sing you a song about kind of the existence of of what it's like to be an existing human and having the power to think. Totally neutral, not making any point, but just kind of calling your attention to just the act of thinking. And I think it's really beautiful to kind of say, like, depict thinking, but don't make me notice it. Yeah.
So do you think the yellow of the window next to the darkest dark?
Yeah.
Do you have an idea about the order?
Yeah, so I've seen, not this painting, but I've seen another painting by a follower of Rembrandt's at the National Gallery in London, and it's the same idea. And to me, I wish there is so much lead white on that. That is so built up, and it is really just like so dense. Like the weave is gone, you can't see any surface. So it is just an enormous quantity of lead white. Layered within, again, like tints as well to kind of give it this glow, but it really, like, it took my breath away. It really does look like light coming through a window on a wall. It's like a magic trick. Small painting though.
Where is this painting?
I think this one's in Germany. I could be wrong though. So Rembrandt does meet the nephew of his business partner. Oh, not the nephew, the niece of his his business of his business partner. This is Saskia van Eilenberg, and this is eventually they end up getting married, and they do have a really happy marriage. Although she does have a large dowry, and her family disapproves of Rembrandt's lifestyle and really kind of thinks he's in it for the money. But for all intents and purposes, they do seem, by all depictions, to be very cohesive. So here, Rembrandt's not the painter he is in his later years, where his portraits are really poetic and really kind of have a heavy air of melancholia to them. But when he's with Saskia, he hasn't kind of had that yet. This is really, I think it's one of Rembrandt's greatest works. I think this drawing is so beautiful, it is so tender, it is so intimate. And this was drawn on the day of their betrothal, actually. So if you look at the drawing on the left, there's a bit of an inscription, and the inscription says, "This likeness is of my wife, drawn when we were 21 years old on the 3rd day of our betrothal, the 8th of January, 1634. And so it just kind of gives that person. I also love how the flower stem has like a little bend, or it's broken at the very tip. So Rembrandt, this is, and really his only, technically. But again, Rembrandt always finding the beautiful in the otherwise imperfect. And here they are again. So this is in the biblical story of the prodigal son. The prodigal son takes his fortune and has a good time, and then feels bad about it, and then goes home. So basically, this is him having I'm simplifying that, but this is the prodigal son spending his wealth, and you can see why Saskia's family is a little agitated. You're kind of, this is what we literally think you're doing. And so he's kind of, and in a way you wonder if that's kind of unjust or not. But this is also where he's really at the height of his popularity, the height of his powers. He's really become very popular. Yes, that's Rembrandt and his wife Saskia. That's both of them.
How much older was he than her?
Actually, not by an enormous, much more than like Rubens and his second wife, and much more kind of within range of each other. But I'm not exactly sure how much older. Whoops, sorry. So, and here you can see Rembrandt really again going big. These are almost life-size figures. This is the Feast of Balthazar, and you can really see again where he's trying to. Take again Rubens kind of again this like this huge kind of universality to everything, but kind of make it a little bit more tangible. I mean, if you look at the detailing on when you look at these in person, I really wish I could have the ways to describe. Like, it does feel like he almost puts a layer of paint down and then scrapes out what he doesn't want. It is so incredibly thick. But because he has those thick lights, and you remember like these areas where he's keeping the inventing, these thin shadows, those on the same surface, it literally looks like that figure's going to almost fall out. It's the most amazing magic trick you'll ever see. And Rembrandt being the ever observer, this woman is using a sacred chalice to drink from, and she's so startled by the apparition that's happening. She's spilling her wine, and her wine would wet her sleeve, of course. So the red changes color as it gets wet, it gets darker. So this is Rembrandt kind of, again, like Caravaggio, bringing in observational realism. So like this is what would happen. I'm basing this more and more off of our real world. So again, making it feel more like, if you look at the whole composition and everything, it's spilling out into our environment. Anytime figures pop out of the frame, it's kind of evoking the painting kind of entering our space, and that he's kind of making us a participant in this painting.
What does the Hebrew say?
Yeah. So he did. So yeah. So what's funny about this is that he did go through he did live in a Jewish part of the community, and he did have friends who that he consulted, but there's a mistranslation and they're arranged in the wrong order, so they don't say what they're supposed to. Yeah. So it's like, so he A for effort kind of a situation.
Wait, do you think he knew?
No, it was out of ignorance. Yeah. So I think, generally speaking, it says the days of your kingdom are numbered, or something along those lines.
It's supposed to say that.
Yeah, that's what it's supposed to say. Yeah. So Rembrandt is also doing amazing portraits at this time. I mean, so here he is painting the eligible daughter of kind of what we would call a billionaire by today's standards, the Tripp family. And Rembrandt had to walk this tightrope that is often talked about where, this is a Protestant country. We can't show opulence, but we have to show that we are of well standing. And that's where it comes to the details, the lace, this kind of, this expensive layered lace. It's still kind of somewhat reverent, but it does demonstrate the wealth of the family and the wealth you'd be buying into at this time. So Rembrandt is also putting down thin layers of lead white and also removing to create these effects. These blues that you see, the almost like the color of smoke against a black curtain. He is actually doing that by floating these thin layers of lead white. Again, using paint as a sculptural medium, not just on a flat surface.
How did he do the removal? What kind of tool did he? It was the white dog. Did he use
Yeah,
a
yes, yes.
It was the Kemper Whiteout.
Yes.
Sponsored.
So yeah, well, in a lot of instances, it is like the end of a brush that he's kind of using to kind of like take out. Or in some instances, it's kind of like I would imagine a clean brush or something along those lines.
Do you think he's actually copying a piece of lace?
Yes, yes. So this is very much, so this clothing most likely would have been on a dummy, on some kind of mannequin, which would have allowed him to get such precise detail, and she would come in periodically for the portrait itself, most likely. That would be typical, as you can imagine, be very demanding on somebody. And that also gave the artist the free, I can take my time and I can really make this look good. I'm not pressured. This is at the MFA as well. And again, the same techniques are being used for this lace collar. So we can, this is just called Lady with a Gold Chain, doesn't really have, unfortunately, not a title there. But here again, same application for the lace. And so again, so a little bit of a prelude of things to come, where this is kind of a little bit of a foreshadowing of the Night Watch. And it also shows one of the kind of Rembrandt kind of compositional models or molds that he uses, where it's this kind of like the Rembrandt sandwich, if you want to, where he shows you a light in the back, a dark in the middle, a light in the front. So, and that dark in the middle is just a creative way of kind of providing opportunities for more dramatic lighting effects, of course. But it also is a more creative way of showing distance. It's a little bit easier to manipulate things in that way. And he uses it to varying degrees. But
My question, did he actually invent all those lights himself? Because they didn't have, what did he use for real light?
the sun.
Or the window?
The window, yeah, the sun, yeah. He would just go to so you had to work by north light based, that would be ideal. So like an artist, so like you would have to, so Rubens got up at 4 a.m. every day, worked till 5 p.m. at night, and then went horseback riding.
Same.
Yeah, yeah. He would get up at 4, and I believe go to mass every morning. So he was a devout Catholic. But you can see why Rembrandt is so popular. And again, another kind of, if we think back to that idea of the hand gestures. So here we can see the doctor flaying the figure, showing you the inner workings of the hand. You can see the gesture then the doctor is demonstrating if I pull the muscles. And then in a way, he's demonstrating the posture of holding a brush. So Rembrandt is kind of in a way telling you like the anatomy of like the hand that you're seeing anatomized and gestured is also a hand that is now painted. That's kind of, again, these mind games are kind of very often. Oh, of course, yeah. Yeah, well, he actually goes against the norm of traveling outside his country to go study. We don't have any evidence of him studying outside of his own, like 20-mile radius or something like that. But Rembrandt's house is actually a museum now, and you can actually, and so he affords, with all of his wealth, this ability to buy this house. Yeah, you were just there? Oh, you were just there? Yeah. Oh, you've been there. Oh,
You also have a
Gary,
big
can you go to the
collection.
previous slide for a second? The one of the, I didn't realize
Yeah.
that there's a book, and this guy's looking at the book there. I'm guessing
Yeah.
he's looking at it's an anatomy book. Yeah. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting.
yeah. So this whole interaction. I mean, like the other guy's like leaning over to kind of really give it.
And they got the back.
So he takes the corporate portrait and makes it kind of an action piece rather than like everybody standing side by side.
Yeah,
So-
just noticed. Yeah, just noticed that. Yeah.
So Rembrandt also has another problem is that he's a shopaholic. He buys a lot of things. He buys artwork. He buys Roman sculpture. He buys like a stuffed like armadillos, spears. What looks like some pieces from the Americas at this time. Some like birds of paradise, things like that. And he just can't like he just keeps. He just has he has really good taste. Just
Yeah.
expensive
Yeah.
taste. So, and we do have, so this I believe is in the Rembrandt house. They recreated this. When Rembrandt there's an inventory, not when he dies, but when he declares bankruptcy. There's basically a they go through the inventory, and so we can kind of count everything. So if you were a pupil or if you were a student of Rembrandt, or if you were one of the people where he did have a business where you would like copies to order, like where you would want a copy of something, and one of the students would paint that. So you were given a little cubicle, and this would be your workstation. So things haven't changed much, as you can see. But I mean, I do have to say, if all those are north-facing windows, like. So in here he is kind of in these years, and you can see this really is kind of like satiny, satin and fur, kind of really, like just really kind of living it up and really just kind of the finest satins. Amsterdam being a huge port at this time.
Could you be painting by candlelight at all, though?
Yes, you could. You certainly could, and I think, and so there might be some of that. The problem, though, I think that might happen is, like it would be hard to see like you'd just be hard to see, like you could see some things, but like the color would be off. It could be a fire nightmare, but yeah. So like, but you could. Goya does do that, and Michelangelo carved at night. In his 80s, he was like, I try to carve by day, but I can't change a lifetime of habits. He would carve at night by candlelight. So sculptors can. But Saskia, who has sat for Rembrandt, numerous times, and so he does etchings of her. Here they are together. Yes, that hand is enormous to that hand. Like head-to-hand ratio is enormous. Yeah. Saskia does become ill, most likely with tuberculosis, and he does actually sketch her while she's dying. And it's a really kind of sincere diary in a way of this period in Rembrandt's life. And he does paint her in a few different ways. Here we have a maid kind of at the bedside. They have one surviving son, Titus. I believe they have 3 or 4 other children that all die within the first months of birth. But this was also kind of somewhat common, unfortunately, at this time period. Rembrandt unfortunately also outlives his son and also sees Titus's death as well. So they really don't have the best of luck with that. But Saskia does in fact pass away. And after her death, Rembrandt actually finishes this portrait of her. So he picks this up after her death and completes it. So going back to the Salome, if that's Rubens, it is kind of possible because like you could do a portrait post-mortem, essentially. Rembrandt does that actually at another occasion too, we'll see. But Saskia does eventually pass away. And so we start to get here into Rembrandt's late period, where really Rembrandt starts to kind of become known for the Rembrandtian quality we know him for. And his method does change a little bit as the years have gone by. So some of the things that change in Rembrandt's later period is he's no longer working on a yellowish or kind of gray ground. He's now chooses a dark gray or a dark gray brown or just a dark brown imprimatura for the most part. There are accounts of him from some observers using white chalk to kind of gesture his first marks, if you will. But it's not really solid that that's the case, but there is evidence of him, like we saw with Rubens, going directly to canvas, and like Caravaggio would go directly to canvas and would start that way. So on top of that, he would paint directly. So this is where he's actually skipping over stages. Like, so he's skipping over this whole monochromatic underpainting, glaze with the color, work into it. He's going right from the dark canvas right to build up, and he's just working up from the start, and still using the dark of the canvas as a tone when possible. And this is what are employed as local imprimaturas. So when he builds up the paint, so let me just jump to this slide here really quick. So this is really probably the first and only, like, this is one session, basically, for Rembrandt at this stage. You can see the dark, the bag of the eye, the shadow of the eyebrow. All of that is the tone of the canvas, and all of this around is thick, really thick paint. So he's building this up, and he's kind of working up right from the start. All the shadow side of the face is pretty much the ground itself. Right. So the other thing that Rembrandt also used was he scried into his paintings a lot. We saw with the lace sometimes, but he also actually would make notes to himself. So a lot of people think that, oh, they're like, he meant to keep that. He's painting very directly at this point. So he's making notes to himself. Like, you'll see the hair, like, I want the hair to come out to here. So so he scries into the wet paint. Sometimes he does leave it because it catches the paint in a way, and he's like, oh, actually, funnily enough, that works. But we see this in a few different pieces. So here, this is a little hard to see this, but if you look in the upper left-hand corner, like the hair that's on the left-hand side underneath the brim of the hat, you can see some scrying marks, meaning that if Rembrandt were to continue on this, he would actually build the hair out more. This is also probably maybe 1 to 2 sittings with Rembrandt. This is actually him, again, expediting his process. He's more direct. This is very much against the fashion of the day, which, as I was talking about earlier, are importing the Italian taste of smooth, solid surfaces. The Rococo era is kind of being ushered in little by little. So in the self-portrait at Kenmore House, we can also see evidence of that. This is another Rembrandt painting that has essays about what these circles mean in the background, and all that sort of thing.
What kinds of mirrors did they have to be able to enable an artist to do so?
Well, they did have mirrors that were very, clear enough. And actually, there's a story about when Rembrandt is moving, he has an antique mirror in this antique frame, and his son Titus it's too heavy for him to lift, so he hires a bargeman to carry it over the bridge, and the bargeman slips and it breaks. So he shows up to his father's house with just the empty frame, and they take him to court, and people show up, and it's like, well, he did slip, and then he gets off the hook. But they did have mirrors that would be clear enough by standards to kind of see yourself as we would know it. So if we look above the eyebrow here, we can see a scry mark, either a note to self or a planning for a future pass of some sort there. This also, so this again is, you could almost see, if you look at the forehead, I know this might be, you can see the brush signature of him actually doing a motion like this on the forehead. So he's being very generous with the paint. He is allowing the paint to mix on the canvas but that takes a level of mastery. You have to, you're literally controlling mud. Like, paint is mud. It's pigment, it's earth in oil, it's like mud. So what he's doing, though, in this practice, though, so he's building up this way. So let's say that this is session 2, and he wants to rework this area. So in prior years, Rembrandt would put a thin layer over that. In these later years, he puts a thick layer of an average that out. He'll take pick the average flesh tone, paint that in, and then come back to it. He basically re-imprimaturas that area. And so when you look at late Rembrandt, you'll see this complex topography of surface, and it bewilders people, like it bewildered them a lot before, and it still does, where you see brush marks going one way but others going another, and it's this complex interworking of pages of these applications of direct application, imprimatura, direct application, imprimatura, rinse and repeat. Yeah.
So this be kind of like people talk about Sargent, and every time he would paint, if he wasn't totally happy, he'd scrape
that, right? or blend it out.
Way him
taking it back to
like in the imprimatura, he's just basically like saying no, go back to like that.
Yep. Let's go back to 0. Yeah, basically let me erase it. And so when again built up, you start to get this finish, which with the nature of lead white, it almost suggests pores of the skin and has this real lifelike quality. I think this is a crappy painting I took in the London, the National Gallery. This was 2010, so cameras weren't what they were, or what they are rather. And so this is at the Met here. Another late portrait. So all of the shadow on the inside of the eye sockets here, the shadow around the neck, all of that is the ground of the canvas. So a real economical use. The gilding on the frame behind her is a single brushstroke of him kind of doing a zigzag up and down, but it looks like gilding from this. It is a mastery of, I can make you believe this. It's kind of like a sci-fi character that can make you believe you're seeing something that is not really there. The power of suggestion. This is also at the Met, and this is one of the first paintings I ever remember seeing in my life. And this is a painting of Aristotle resting his hand on Homer. And this actually was rejected by the person who bought it. He said it looked unfinished and sent it back to Rembrandt. And so, it's a huge painting. This is pretty much a life-size figure. And he's contemplating the philosophies of Homer, and the take that the Met has, or the interpretation the Met has of this painting, is that on the medallion that you see draped on the shoulder, you can see a portrait, and it's of Alexander the Great, Aristotle's patron. And so Aristotle's weighing his monetary successes with Homer's kind of eternity of influence, in a sense. And it reminded me of Caravaggio, because here he's using, so just as Caravaggio used light as a metaphor of enlightenment, he's using it as an emotional tool. So is Rembrandt, in that remember in the spiral staircase, the shadows represent the unconscious or distance. So here his head is in shadow, he is lost in thought in a pensive way. So he's using light as a poetic tool.
Portraits look so melancholy.
Yeah, he's going through it. He is. So he's had a hard time paying bills. He has to declare bankruptcy. He does take on a wet nurse who helps him with Titus. He then finds another nurse that he likes more.
You mean because his wife died while...
His wife died, and his wife left...
While Titus was young.
So Titus was still alive. She leaves Rembrandt the fortune as long as he doesn't get married again. And so he does find Hendrikia Stoffels, and they do, it seems, fall in love. And they live in sin, basically. She's forbidden to, when this is all exposed, she's not allowed to take communion again, which would have been a very serious crime for, like an offense for that to happen. So he outlives her. He basically outlives everyone around him. So he really does have a really kind of sad ending. But this shirt is amazing, and but you can see again here I know it might be a little hard up there, but like the end of the brush scrying in the upper shoulder there, you can see these kind of like valleys, and it's this complex weaving of layers of attempts that give Rembrandt his richness of surface. And then of course there's the Jewish bride. Really, Van Gogh said that he would give a week of his life away if he could have like one full night alone with the painting to like watch it and look at it. That sounded a little strange. So this is a painting that's really some consider his greatest, and it really is a demonstration of him really at his peak. There is so egg yolk emulsion. Excuse me. Sounds like an indie band. Egg yolk emulsion. So there is actually egg and oil that are basically whipped together to again make this painter mayonnaise, and that's kind of used to actually for the glazing, which helps to expedite the drying. But to show you some of the more kind of sculptural elements, you can really see that the sleeve, this golden sleeve, is really almost literally constructed of mounds of oil paint. It literally projects off the surface The highlights on the ring are incredibly convincing. They make the hands read so soft. And a lot is read about the painting. I mean, there's some, it's a couple, but it's really somewhat ambiguous, where it's in the sense of the fact that where the hand is it on the heart, or is it kind of a little bit lower, representing kind of issue with child, for example, and things like that. But all that background is pretty much the ground. This brown that we're seeing back there, you can see the inventing of like shrubbery in the back. There's a little bit of a pillar in the background as well. So mounds of paint applied with tools that are not brushes, but not exactly sure what. But there are mounds of paint that are applied with a flattish object. Could be a palette knife, but if you look on the very far left side, you will see kind of like scrapes, scribbles, he's creating a texture for the next layers of paint to do more interesting things with, essentially. So then, of course, is one of his most famous pieces, the Night Watch. And as we see it today, the Night Watch is the reason it's most kind of one of the reasons it's so popular is that this, yeah, these are guild portraits, kind of which Rembrandt was kind of accustomed to. So he was commissioned by the guild to paint the portrait. 18 of these men are the ones who commissioned the portrait. The rest are kind of extra cast members he brought in to fill the scene. And this is really the typical kind of portraiture of the day, where they're all lined up so you can see who everyone is, and everyone's happy because their likeness is represented as, to the fullest extent. So Rembrandt changes that and makes this really, again, a scene of action. So let me go back to how it is today. So you can see that it's not side by side next to each other. There's a back to front motion. There's a side to left motion. Things are in movement, not stagnant. However, Van Hoogstraten, who was one of his pupils, said Rembrandt prizes larger pictorial effect over likeness, and that's very much true. So he is willing to kind of not represent all of his paying customers perfectly legibly for the greater pictorial effect, which is kind of a risky thing, being the person being commissioned. It was, so if you, like the idea is like right away it was kind of trash, like oh my God, like especially if you ever watch the 1930 something movie about Rembrandt, it's so over dramatized, it's really good. But it wasn't met with like rejection right away. It was more, so Van Hoogstraten, who I brought up, he criticized it a little bit, and from that criticism kind of caught on, and but it wasn't that they were kind of like maybe puzzled a little bit by it, because it's like, oh, I don't dislike it, but kind of one of those instances where everyone's looking around to gauge everyone else's reaction, kind of an instance. But it wasn't kind of like it was presented and everyone was like, like shocked by it necessarily.
So then it just went to hang in the guild hall or wherever people congregated?
Yes, essentially it would be, so it was kind of a shared commission. The painting is cut though, and here at the Rijksmuseum they've actually added the extra about 2 feet to the left-hand side of the painting. So if you see where that line is down the side, the painting is actually cut. And you can see that with that little bit of addition, you can see that the marching is really moving forward and to the left. In its current state, you kind of don't really get that feeling. It feels a little bit more constricted because that's not its proper design.
Who cut it?
Was
it Rembrandt himself, or was it somebody else?
I think I want to say it was somebody else. But he does cut his own work, but not this one, I don't think. So these are some close-ups of some of these larger figures. So again, most of the shadow is, again, the ground or the inventing stages. Now again, another little subliminal kind of element here. The cast shadow of the hand of the so this is the so the man in the black here is kind of the one leading the charge, and so he is ordering the move forward, and we're all going to be marching now. So you can see that because he is the commander, if you look right above where the cast shadow falls, there is this emblem of an animal, which is the emblem of the guild itself. So he kind of holds the command of the guild in his hand. So kind of very, again, a very subliminal way of introducing a kind of an idea. this painting is crusty. Like, I mean, like there are no joke. There are build-ups. If you go on the Rijksmuseum website, they'll be able to, like, you can really, it's really incredible. I'd like to, like, kind of like feel that a bit.
It's like that's some crust.
Well, I
Yeah,
have a
exactly.
question about that,
Yeah.
actually, about the crustiness.
Yeah.
So if it's crusty,
Mhm.
where that hand shadow is,
Mhm.
isn't that going to create like specular highlights? Is it not crusty in the shadow area?
Yeah, not crusty in the
So
shadow.
it's only crusty
In the
lights.
embroidery on the
But,
lights.
So he already kind of had to have had that plan.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Before he starts adding the crust.
Yep.
Okay.
Plan before crust. Words to live by.
That's a good.
Yeah. So again, just showing the kind of the wizardry here. You can see even like the seam in the glove on the thumb being depicted, and just the paint really troweled on in the front here to really give it its dimensional, almost as if it's poking into our environment. And then again, so the little girl in the background is also kind of a questionable. There are different opinions about that. One of the more popular theories is that it's kind of a mascot for the troupe. And again, I believe the bird that's hanging from her leg is also a symbol of the guild. So she might be kind of more of a fictitious or kind of allegorical role than real. So, and that's Rembrandt. This is a little self-portrait. He's peeking, yeah, the little eyeball. So he's kind of literally in the background, like peeking over the shoulder of what's happening.
They know it's him.
Because it is, Julie. No, I don't know. It is one of those things where it's easy to imagine that being the case, and it kind of seems like it's an easy thing to do. So, but do we know? Yeah.
Who else would
Yeah. And so this is Hendrikia. This is the woman who he's in a relationship with, but not married. And this is where, Rembrandt is really kind of becoming more of his painterly self. You can see that thumb is literally a singular brushstroke, one. The yellow that is kind of the yellow gaps in between the grays on the shirt that she's lifting in the waters is the ground of the canvas coming through. So still using that as a tone when appropriate. And so this monochromatic underpainting of the arm, this would also be something he would go on top of, but in this instance, he's left it. So this is a very limited palette. I mean, the robe is golden behind her, but that kind of almost colorizes things. And this is the part of a dual portrait of the Gier family. I am so sorry if I am butchering these Dutch names, folks. But this is actually a posthumous portrait. This man has been long dead at this point. Rembrandt is using two other portraits to make this portrait. So he's using two other people's paintings as reference to make this one. But the painting of the wife is really absolutely beautiful. You can really see the textural effects are at their full form. The relatability, just the emotional intensity, everything about it is really kind of Rembrandt in peak form. And he does another portrait of her here, which I think is a bit better in my opinion. And it's so that the whole temple region is underpainting, but it gets beyond that. I mean, like the collar alone is just really stunning. Even in this late period, he's still demonstrating, I've still got it. Like I've still got skill and I can still draw very, very expertly if needed. And I thought I would end on this note. This is actually the last painting that is assumed that Rembrandt was working on, and it remains somewhat unfinished. But it was reported, I can't remember if it was that it was the last on his easel or it was just one of the last in his house. But this is one of the first early ones if we think back to Simon, the figure being presented in the temple with the penumbra on the back of that standing figure. Same subject, but very different. Anyway, thank you all so much for your attention, and I'll welcome any questions, but I know I've taken so much of your time. Thank you. Sorry. All right. Thanks, folks.
It's the highest limit.
Yeah.